all of you are, the kind of people who don't just have live free or die on your license plate. You believe it, you live it. And that's why we wanted to be here, because this is a moment, as Jay was just saying, in which that is actually on the line. Our freedoms are actually on the line. In a way that, having been through the Reagan period, having worked, as did Roger, for the president, I didn't actually architect the strategy as much as Roger did, but I had a hand in executing it, that's for sure, in the Pentagon. The threat posed by the Soviet Union in the darkest days of the Cold War pales into insignificance compared to what we're facing right now. And we're going to talk to you at some length about why that is so and what we can do about it, which is really the point. It's not just to scare you, it's not just to alarm you or even incense you, it's to say, join us in doing what we can to ensure that we're able to pass on to our children, and as Reagan used to say, our children's children, the freedoms that we take for granted, most of us, because they are on the line. Let me tell you why. They're on the line because today's existential threat to freedom has set about in a determined, disciplined, patient way to supplant us as the world's dominant power and recast the world, recast the nations of the world, recast the institutions, many of which we helped put into place after World War II, with what they call Chinese characteristics. And the trouble with Chinese characteristics, if you weren't paying attention to this before the coronavirus, I suspect, like an awful lot of other Americans, you are now. Chinese characteristics are horrific. And this is not a racist comment, this is not a xenophobic comment, this is an objective statement of fact. And here's just one example. A government that has now put into place the most comprehensive system for surveilling, monitoring, and controlling people in the history of the world. Something that would make George Orwell's fantasy of 1984 look like, I don't know, the founders, constitutional Congress. Because it is so oppressive. For example, if they did, and I'm frankly skeptical, but let's just say for the purposes of this discussion, they did succeed in crushing the coronavirus after letting it run rampant for a couple of months. They did it, and they're claiming they did it by bringing to bear surveillance technologies, including things like cameras, all over the country, hundreds of millions of them. Roger will tell you more about where they come from. And facial recognition technology, and speech recognition technology, and gait recognition technology. And exotic things like quantum computing, whatever that is, powerful, supercomputing generation upon generation. Artificial intelligence, data mining, to essentially be able to monitor what everybody is doing, virtually 24/7. What they're buying, what they're writing, what they're saying, what they are otherwise doing, perhaps jaywalking, perhaps saying something against the party. Whatever it is all now being computed and assessed and translated into something that's called the social credit system, whereby you can get a good social credit rating by playing ball with the party, doing what it tells you to do. And you can not play ball, but be punished for it in real time. Such that if your social credit score system, for example, doesn't meet the standards that the party expects, and of course when I talk about the party, I'm not talking about the Republican Party, I'm not talking about the Democrat, I'm talking about the Chinese Communist Party, the one party in China. And that party will assess you have deviated, and you will not be allowed to travel. You will not be allowed to rent an apartment. You will not be allowed to go to a certain school or your children. You may not be able to get a job or keep the one you have. You may, in short, find yourself unable to feed your family. I mean, these are the sorts of coercive techniques that sound pretty bad in the abstract, but we watched them in practice here in recent days. To the point where, you may have heard these statistics, I mean, it's mind-boggling, but 100 million Chinese were locked down in their place of abode. In some cases, they went to the extreme measure of actually sealing the doors so as to ensure that you could not get out of your apartment. There are videos on YouTube that you can listen to if you can stand it, of people going out on the balconies if they have them, or just out the open windows of their apartments, screaming because of the nightmare that had become their lives, being locked in these apartments. How did they do that? They did that by applying these same tools and techniques. And here's the real kicker, folks. You're going to hear more about this, I suspect, in the days to come. They're now taking credit for having crushed the disease as part of a marketing campaign to try to sell this social credit system to other countries around the world, so that they too can use it for health care management. But oh, by the way, also use it to control populations. So when you think about this, it's really not too much of a stretch to realize that what is at stake here is freedom. Now you may say, well, that wouldn't happen here. Are you sure? Are you sure that even in states like this, where people do prize freedom, it won't ever happen here? Well, just as an example, thought experiment. One of the companies that the Chinese Communist Party has been using as part of its build-out of its surveillance state apparatus, its intelligence collection capabilities, its power projection, is something called Huawei. Has anybody ever heard of Huawei? Huawei is the world's largest telecommunications conglomerate. It is essentially a Chinese state-owned enterprise, though it professes to be private sector, but it's basically the Chinese Communist Party's means of spreading around the world wireless technology. Now, at the moment on offer, is 5G, fifth generation wireless technology. And they're making tremendous progress in insinuating this technology into lots of countries, including some with whom we are closely allied, like Great Britain, for example. And that, by the way, is happening over the adamant objections of our country, our government, which has gone to them and said, look, you're one of our most intimate allies. We share with you everything we've got in terms of intelligence. We call you one of the Five Eyes, which are basically the Anglosphere countries that have been closely partnered up since World War II, in some cases before, but have been particularly active in fighting against these totalitarian threats. And we've said to the Brits, you can't let Huawei into your digital networks without making it impossible for us to share intelligence with you. Why is that? Because we can't share it with you without sharing it with the Chinese Communist Party. Because the feed of anything that they own and operate or run or supply telecommunications equipment for or what have you will wind up being collected and fed into that same basic maw of the processing and the computing and the analyzing, and used for their purposes against us, among others. Because in the end, let's face it, we are the impediment to the realization of their global ambitions, right? Among the other applications of all of this is the oppression of, the estimates vary, 1 to 3 million Uyghur Muslims in Western China, Xinjiang. They're not the only faith minority that is being persecuted, to be sure, but this one is now being reduced to the population of concentration camps. 1,000 or so of them have been built, apparently, in Western China. And here's a kicker, folks, I'm trying to really help you appreciate the character of a regime that would do this to its own people, point to which I'm going to return. When they mostly, not exclusively, but they mostly send young male heads of family and others from their homes in Xinjiang off to these concentration camps. One of the other instruments of oppression, of torture, of control, is they put ethnic Han Chinese males in those homes. And they make it known that they're actually sleeping in the same beds as the women who have been left behind. Think about that. Think about that. What that does to the family, what that does to the people who are being incarcerated, what that does to the women, most obviously. This is being done on an unimaginably vast scale. I can go on and on and on. There's the build-out of the Belt and Road Initiative you may have heard about. This is part of I talked about the digital infrastructure, but the counterpart is building airfields and ports and rail systems and road networks for countries on credit. How does that work? Anybody ever heard of a payday loan? You're in the banking business, you know about this. Payday loan. That's how it works. Countries that are not going to be able to make the payments are induced to get all of this free stuff. Does that sound familiar? Free stuff. With the certain knowledge by the Chinese that they will default, and when they do, they will take possession of the assets that they've put into place. And there's not anything accidental about the countries that they have been recruiting to this so-called Belt and Road Initiative. These are countries that are in strategically interesting places. Perhaps they have precious resources, or earth minerals, or oil, or gas, or gold, or something else. Or perhaps they're just a place from which, if you have an airfield, you can project power and control for very strategic purposes. Then there's the effort to dominate space. You know, we have a space program. We're very proud of our space program. It has been on hard times for some time, to be honest, but the Chinese have been working assiduously at not only competing with us, but exceeding us. And not just for, civilian benefit of space research and exploration, for military purposes, because they understand that the high ground of space gives them a whole nother domain from which to project power on the Earth. Then there's just the old-fashioned kind of power, military power. And the Chinese have been laboring away for quite some time. Much of this, we're digressing for just a second, much of this goes back to 1991, when the then General Secretary of the Communist Party, I don't know if you remember this little guy, his name was Deng Xiaoping. And I remember vividly because at the time I was working for a Democratic senator by the name of Scoop Jackson, Henry Scoop Jackson from Washington State. And Scoop Jackson loved Deng Xiaoping. He thought he hung the moon. Principally because at the time we thought Deng Xiaoping and China were going to be a counterweight for us against the Soviet Union, which Scoop properly regarded as that time's existential threat to freedom, as did Ronald Reagan. But it was also helped along by the fact that Deng Xiaoping looked like a koala bear. He was a cute little guy. And he had this sort of happy, face and effect. And lots of people fell for it. Even though he was the guy who basically pulled the trigger on the Tiananmen Square massacre. They forgave him that. Didn't want that to interfere with business. And here's the point. Deng Xiaoping introduced a strategy. It came to be known by a very pithy formulation. The hide and bide strategy. And the hide and bide strategy was basically about doing the sorts of things that I've just enumerated. I mean, you couldn't see all of those things, but the goals were pretty clear. Control the Chinese people. Project power throughout their neighborhood, including into the South China Sea and in Asia, and as far beyond as they could get away with. Dominate as many countries economically as possible, translate that, if you can, into the old-fashioned kind of raw political power and strategic power projection, and ultimately take out the United States. Force it into submission, or, if necessary, defeat it in order to control the world. That was Deng Xiaoping's strategy. But he made it clear that it was necessary to conceal that design, and that one had to be patient. This was going to take time. At the time, in 1991, China was still a very poor country. But over the decades that followed, with the help of a lot of folks in the West who didn't get the true nature of what was afoot because of the hide factor, and because it was being done sort of slowly, incrementally, as well as covertly. You know the old story about the frog in the pot of water that is boiled to death, but only by degrees, doesn't ever notice that it's being boiled, doesn't jump out of the pot. This was kind of the plan. And so what we've seen throughout these years is the successful execution of that strategy and the realization of so many of those different elements in the ways that I've just talked about. But the piece of this that has been much less obvious, even though it's more or less out there to be seen if you know to look for it, is how have they paid for all this? How have they done this? I mean, it's a richer country, to be sure, than it was in 1991. Make no mistake about it. It's a developed nation, for heaven's sakes. Even though, as I think it was the president pointed out the other day, 70% of the lending that is done by the World Bank for developing nations is going to communist China. 70%. That means 30% is for the entire rest of the third world. And the observation was made, wait a minute, you are a developed country. How are you getting any of this money, let alone the lion's share of it? And the answer is because they're China, and because they're dominant power, and because they now are in control of institutions like the World Bank in important respects. So some of this might be explained by World Bank lending, but not all of it. Some of it you might think, well, maybe it's because they've got $3 trillion in foreign reserves. Maybe that's how they're financing this. Well, no, actually, they're not touching that. Or the $1.1 trillion or so in treasury bills that they often use as kind of a lever on us, leverage. No, they're not touching that either. So where are they getting the money? This is lots of expenditures, obviously, to float all of these different threats. To answer that question, I'm very proud to have with me, as was mentioned, one of my dearest friends, one of my oldest colleagues. I didn't actually know him when he was doing his thing on the Reagan National Security Council staff as the Senior Director for International Economic Affairs. I was in the Pentagon. We were working different parts of the strategy. But Roger, by virtue of his experiences earlier in his career in the Chase Manhattan Bank, as a vice president responsible for the bank's lending to the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe and Yugoslavia, and as a special assistant to the bank's chairman, a fellow by the name of David Rockefeller, for some 3 years. Roger had firsthand insights into how the Soviet Union was financing the threat that it posed to us. Relatively modest, and I don't mean to trivialize, large numbers of thermonuclear weapons as modest, except by comparison to what the Chinese are doing. And I didn't finish that thought, by the way, did I? I digressed. In addition to all of the things that I've just mentioned, we also have the Chinese investing massively in old-fashioned military power, including thermonuclear weapons. And maybe we can get into this in Q&A if you want to, but let me just give you one thought on this. Just again, a point of calibration, something you probably have not heard, but you need to think about, because it just gives you a sense of what we're up against. Probably about 5 years or so ago now, a colleague of ours, a member of our Committee on the Present Danger, as a matter of fact, Dr. Phil Carver, with whom I worked in the Pentagon back in the day, brought together some of his students at my alma mater, Georgetown University, some undergrads and some graduate students, and just gave them a special project, just to see what they could do, looking at the open source material to figure out what some construction projects that were going on around the country in China might involve. And do you know what they figured out? Something that had escaped the CIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, all of other classified collection systems. These students, under Phil Carver's leadership at Georgetown University, figured out that the Chinese had built 3,000 miles of hardened underground tunnels. 3,000 miles. I mean, that's half again as large as the distance from one coast of this country to the next. And what are they doing with 3,000 miles of hardened underground tunnels? Well, one of the things that it's reasonable to expect is they're putting thermonuclear missiles in those tunnels and running them around so that they, of course, can't be detected, but they also are very survivable. And the question then occurs, doesn't it, folks? How many of those things do they have? And we've been told by the arms control specialists that, well, they only have about 200, maybe 400 nuclear weapons. 200 to 400 nuclear weapons for 3,000 miles of tunnels? Are you kidding me? Especially now that with our help, you may have heard about all this, Bill Clinton helped the Chinese get the technology to put multiple warheads on those missiles. So they're now capable of launching on one of those missiles up to as many as 10 nuclear warheads. So are you really telling me that there may be 10 missiles? Maybe 20? In 3,000 miles of tunnels? It's not credible. But the question occurs again. How did they find the money to build 3,000 miles, even if it's slave labor? It's still a massive undertaking. I mean, it dwarfs, I guess they got the Great Wall. They call this the underground Great Wall, by the way, the Great Wall of China, but you know, you're talking about that kind of level of effort. Where did they get the money?